They whispered that the west wing of Whitbarrow Keep was a tomb for the living, a place where the air itself tasted of ash and regret. Marcella had been warned to keep her eyes on the floor and her hands busy with the linens, but the sound was impossible to ignore, a low, gurgling whimper that bled through the heavy oak doors at midnight. It wasn't the sound of a monster, as the other servants claimed. It was the sound of something breaking. When she finally defied the Alpha King's law and pushed open that forbidden door, she didn't find a beast waiting to devour her. She found a tragedy buried under years of neglect, and a secret hidden so deep in matted fur that uncovering it would bring a kingdom to its knees. The wind howling through the valley of Whitbarrow did not sound like wind at all. It sounded like the mourning cry of 1,000 wolves. Marcella Rosefall tightened her threadbare wool shawl around her shoulders, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle of her meager trunk. The carriage that had brought her here was already disappearing into the blinding white curtain of the blizzard, leaving her standing at the foot of the most terrifying structure in the Northern Territories. Whitbarrow Keep rose from the jagged black rock like a jagged tooth, carved from obsidian and gray stone that seemed to swallow the meager winter light. It was a fortress built for war, not for comfort, and certainly not for a human maid with no references and nowhere else to go. The massive iron-bound doors groaned open before she could knock. Standing in the threshold was a woman who looked as though she had been carved from the same stone as the castle. "You are late," the woman said. Her voice was dry, like shifting gravel. "The snow, ma'am," Marcella stammered, stepping quickly out of the biting wind and into the cavernous entry hall. The air inside was still, smelling faintly of cedar, beeswax, and something metallic, like old copper. The horses struggled on the incline. The woman's eyes, a sharp, piercing gray, swept over Marcella. "I am Diana Brightmore, head of the household staff. You are here because we are desperate, girl, not because you are qualified. The last 3 maids fled before their first week was out." Marcella swallowed hard. She needed this. The coins in her pocket were non-existent, and the debts her father had left behind were a pack of hounds nipping at her heels. "I am not afraid of hard work, Mrs. Brightmore, nor am I afraid of the cold." "It isn't the cold that sends them running," Diana said, turning on her heel. "Follow me." The tour of the keep was a blur of towering corridors, tapestries depicting violent battles of wolf and man, and shadows that seemed to stretch longer than physics should allow. They passed the great hall, where a massive throne of antler and iron sat empty. "The king?" Marcella asked softly. Diana stopped abruptly. "Alpha Constantine does not wish to be seen. He rules from the shadows these days. He is grieving. You are to avoid the royal quarters unless summoned, which you won't be." They continued deeper into the castle. Marcella noted the dusty silence. It was a place devoid of life, devoid of warmth. They passed a grand staircase leading up to the west wing. A velvet rope blocked the path. "And that?" Marcella pointed. Diana's expression tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "The west wing is condemned. Structural instability. If you value your position and your life, you will never set foot past that rope. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." But as they stood there, a draft swept down the stairs, carrying a scent that made the hair on Marcella's arms stand up. It wasn't just dust, it was the smell of sickness, rot, and beneath it, the faint, undeniable scent of lavender perfume, sweet, cloying, and entirely out of place. "Good," Diana said, though her gaze lingered on the darkness at the top of the stairs for a second too long. "Your duties are the scullery and the linen rotation. You start now. The Alpha expects silence, efficiency, and invisibility. Be the ghost, Marcella, and you might survive the winter." As Marcella walked away, carrying a heavy basket of sheets toward the laundry chutes, she looked back. A woman was standing at the top of the forbidden stairs. She was stunningly beautiful, with cascading blonde hair and a dress of ice-blue silk that hugged every curve. She watched Marcella with eyes that burned with a cold, predatory intelligence. This was Cressida Winterhall, the Alpha's intended mate, or so the village gossip claimed. Cressida smiled, a slow, chilling expression that didn't reach her eyes, before turning and vanishing into the condemned darkness. That night, lying on her cot in the servants' quarters, Marcella couldn't sleep. The wind battered the stone walls, but beneath the gale, she heard it for the first time. A high-pitched, desperate whine. It echoed through the stone ducts of the castle, a sound of pure misery. It came from the west. 3 weeks passed in a gray haze of labor. Marcella scrubbed floors until her knees were bruised and washed linens until her hands were raw and red. She saw Alpha Constantine Whitbarrow only once, a towering figure in a fur-lined cloak, striding through the courtyard. He was terrifyingly large, his presence pressing down on the air around him like a physical weight. His face was a mask of grim fury, a scar running through his dark beard. His eyes burning with a golden fire that seemed to scorch everything he looked at. He looked like a man at war with the world, and perhaps with himself. But it was the nights that haunted Marcella. The whimpering never stopped. On a Tuesday, during a heavy snowstorm that trapped everyone indoors, Diana fell ill with a fever. The castle was understaffed, and the chaotic oversight gave Marcella an opportunity. Carrying a bucket of warm water and a pile of fresh rags, she slipped away from the laundry wing. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot. She approached the velvet rope of the west wing, ducked under it, and began to climb. The air grew colder with every step. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight cutting through the boarded-up windows. The smell of rot was stronger here, the scent of neglected wounds. She reached the top of the landing. A long hallway stretched out, lined with doors. The sound was coming from the very end. Whine, scratch, thump. Marcella approached the heavy oak door. It was locked from the outside with a heavy iron bolt. Why would a condemned room be bolted from the outside? She slid the bolt back. It groaned, the rust protesting. Taking a breath that tasted of fear, she pushed the door open. The room was a nursery, or it had been once. Peeling wallpaper depicted happy woodland creatures, now gray and torn. The windows were shuttered tight. In the center of the room, huddled in the corner furthest from the door, was a pile of what looked like dirty gray rugs. Marcella stepped closer, lifting her lantern. "Hello?" she whispered. The pile moved. It wasn't a rug. It was a wolf, but it was small, scarcely bigger than a large dog, though its proportions were all wrong. It was emaciated, its ribs protruding sharply through fur that was matted with filth, food, and excrement. The creature lifted its head. Its eyes were milky with infection, but beneath the haze they were a striking, terrifying blue. "Oh, you poor thing," Marcella breathed, dropping to her knees. This must be a shifter pup. A child stuck in their wolf form. It happened sometimes when trauma prevented a shift. The wolf snarled, a weak, wet sound, and tried to scramble backward. It dragged its hind legs. "I'm not going to hurt you," Marcella said, her voice trembling but gentle. She dipped a rag into the warm water. "I just want to help." The wolf was too weak to fight. As she reached out, the creature flinched, expecting a blow. When the warm, wet cloth touched its flank, a shudder went through its small body. Marcella worked for an hour, ignoring the biting cold of the room. She cleaned away the layers of filth. It was a male, she realized, a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old if he were human. She reached his neck. The fur here was incredibly thick, matted into a hard shell that felt like armor. The wolf whimpered as she touched it, a sound of agony that tore at Marcella's heart. "Shh, I know it hurts," she murmured, soothing him, "but I have to get this dirt off." She used her fingernails to gently pry apart a clump of dried mud and blood near the base of his skull. It wouldn't give. It felt anchored. She brought the lantern closer. What she saw made her gasp, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Buried deep in the ruff of the wolf's neck, hidden perfectly by the overgrown fur, was a collar. But not a normal collar. It was a band of tarnished silver, poison to shifters, but it was worse than that. The silver had spikes on the inside, and entwined with the silver was a dark pulsating object, a rune-carved stone embedded directly into the flesh, the skin having grown over it in a grotesque scarring keloid. It wasn't just restraining him. The device was designed to trigger pain whenever he tried to access his inner magic to shift back to human form. "Oh God," Marcella whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "Who did this to you?" The wolf looked at her, and for a moment the milky haze cleared. Intelligence, human intelligence, flashed in those blue eyes. He whined, pushing his head into her hand, begging, "Help me." Marcella grabbed a pair of small sewing shears from her apron pocket. "I can't get the collar off," she whispered frantically, "but I can cut the hair away to relieve the pressure. I can clean the infection." She began to snip. Snipping away the matted fur revealed raw red skin that oozed pus. The smell was horrific, but Marcella didn't pull away. She cleaned the wound with the warm water. As she cleaned, she found something else caught in the metal clasp of the torture device. A single, long strand of golden hair. Cressida. Marcella's hands shook. This wasn't neglect. This was torture. This was an assassination happening in slow motion. She was so focused on the task, so consumed by the horror of the discovery, that she didn't hear the heavy footsteps thundering down the hallway. She didn't hear the growl that shook the floorboards until the door behind her was kicked open with enough force to shatter the wood. The room seemed to shrink as Alpha Constantine Whitbarrow filled the doorway. He was a nightmare made flesh. The shadows clung to him, and the torchlight from the hall cast his face in demonic relief. His canines were lengthened, his eyes glowing with the molten gold of an alpha on the brink of violence. "Get away from it!" The roar was physical. It slammed into Marcella, vibrating in her chest. She didn't run. Instinct screamed at her to flee, to grovel, to submit, but her hand was resting on the trembling flank of the pup, and she could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. If she moved, he would die. Constantine stormed into the room, his boots crushing the debris on the floor. "I gave orders," he snarled, his voice a low rumble of thunder. "No one enters, no one touches the beast." "He's not a beast," Marcella shouted back. The silence that followed was deafening. No one yelled at the alpha. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Constantine stopped mere feet from her. He towered over her kneeling form, his chest heaving. He looked at her as if she were an insect. He couldn't decide whether to crush or study. "You dare?" he whispered, and the quiet was more terrifying than the shout. "You dare speak to me? That thing killed my son. It is a feral monster that wears his skin." "He is your son!" Marcella cried, tears streaming down her face now, not from fear but from fury. She stood up, placing her body between the massive alpha and the cowering pup. "And he is dying. He is dangerous," Constantine growled, though he didn't advance. "He attacks everyone. He is mad." Cressida said. Cressida lied. Marcella cut him off. Her voice was steady now, anchored by the truth she held in her hands. Constantine's eyes narrowed. "Careful, girl. You speak of my future mate. She has tended to Frederick when no one else would. She told me his wolf had gone rabid, that he needed isolation to protect the pack. Did she tell you about this?" Marcella stepped aside but kept a hand on the pup's head. She pointed to the raw, oozing wound on the wolf's neck. Look at what I found." Constantine stared. For a moment he refused to look, his face twisted in a mixture of grief and revulsion. He had avoided this room for years, believing the lie that his son was gone, replaced by a mindless beast. "Look," she commanded. The alpha dropped to one knee. The movement was heavy, reluctant. He leaned in, the scent of rain and pine overwhelming Marcella's senses. He peered at the neck of the small wolf. Frederick the pup whined. It was a sound of pure terror. He tried to scuttle back, wetting himself in fear of his own father. Constantine froze. He saw the glint of tarnished silver. He saw the biomechanical rune embedded in the flesh. He saw the pus in the raw skin where the metal dug in. "Silver!" Constantine breathed. The word fractured in his throat. He reached out a trembling hand, his massive claws retracting, his fingers hovering inches from the wound. Silver. And a binding rune. "It punishes him when he tries to shift," Marcella explained softly, watching the king's face crumble. "He isn't feral, my king. He's in agony. He's been trapped in this form, in this room, in pain, for years." Constantine touched the metal. A spark of magic leaped from it, burning his finger, but he didn't pull away. He traced the line of the collar deep into the fur. "Cressida told me." Constantine's voice sounded hollow, like a bell rung underwater. "She told me he was contagious. She said the collar was a medicinal charm to keep the madness at bay." "It is a torture device," Marcella said. She held up the long golden hair she had untangled from the clasp. It caught the lantern light, shining innocently. "And I think she tightened it recently." The change in the room was instantaneous. The grief on Constantine's face vanished, replaced by a rage so cold, so absolute, that the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The golden fire in his eyes turned to shards of ice. The muscles in his back rippled, his shirt straining as his own wolf rose to the surface, demanding blood. He looked at the small broken creature that was his son. Then he looked at Marcella. For the first time, he truly saw her. He saw the dirt on her apron, the blood on her hands, the fierce protectiveness in her stance. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Marcella. Marcella Rosefall." Constantine stood up. He seemed taller than before, a titan of vengeance. He took off his heavy fur cloak and, with surprising gentleness, draped it over Marcella and the shivering pup. "Marcella Rosefall," he said, and the air crackled with the power of an alpha's command. "Do not leave his side. If anyone tries to enter this room, anyone, you scream." He turned toward the door, his boots echoing with the promise of violence. "Where are you going?" she whispered. Constantine paused at the shattered doorframe. He didn't look back, but his hands curled into fists so tight that blood dripped from his palms. "I am going to remind this castle who the Alpha is," he said, "and then I am going to hunt." The silence of the West Wing was shattered by the sound of boots on stone and the frantic shouting of orders. But in the center of the storm, inside the nursery, time seemed to move like molasses. Marcella had not moved. She sat on the floor, the heavy fur cloak of the Alpha King draped over her shoulders, encompassing both her and the trembling wolf. Frederick, the boy trapped in the beast, had pressed his face into her stomach, his breathing ragged and wet. Constantine returned not with guards, but with an old man carrying a leather satchel that smelled of dried sage and rubbing alcohol. This was Rowan Elmsworth, the pack's oldest healer, a man who had been banished to the village clinic years ago by Cressida's decree. "Is it true?" Rowan asked, his voice shaking as he stepped into the room. He looked at the huddled form of the prince. "Great Luna, tell me it isn't true." "Do not speak," Constantine commanded, his voice tight with a terrifying restraint. "Just work. Get it off him." Constantine knelt beside Marcella. The rage that had radiated from him moments ago had been boxed away, contained behind a wall of icy discipline, but Marcella could feel the heat of it coming off him in waves. He looked at his son, and for the first time, he reached out. The wolf flinched. Constantine froze. The pain on his face was raw, an open wound. "It's me, Fred," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's Papa. I'm here." Frederick didn't pull away this time, but he didn't lean in. He stayed glued to Marcella. "He trusts you," Constantine murmured, looking at Marcella with an intensity that made her breath hitch. His golden eyes searched hers. "Hold him. If he trashes when we cut the silver, the spikes will tear his throat." Marcella nodded. She wrapped her arms around the wolf's neck, burying her face in his fur to shield him from the sight of the tools. "I've got you," she whispered into his ear. "Look at me. Focus on my voice." Rowan produced a pair of heavy iron shears enchanted with rune-breaking sigils. "This will burn," the healer warned. "The silver has rooted itself." "Do it," Constantine said. The sound of the metal snapping was like a gunshot. Frederick screamed, a human scream from a wolf's throat, and his body convulsed. Marcella held on with everything she had, her muscles straining as the wolf thrashed. Constantine threw his weight over the boy's hindquarters, pinning him gently but firmly. "Almost there," Rowan grunted, sweat beading on his forehead. "The flesh has grown over the latch. God in heaven, the cruelty." With a sickening squelch and a final metallic snap, the collar gave way. Rowan yanked it free and threw it across the room. It hit the wall, hissing as the dark magic within it dissipated into black smoke. The effect was instantaneous. The small wolf gasped, his body arching. The bones cracked and reshaped with a wet, grinding sound that made Marcella wince. The fur receded. The snout shortened. In a matter of seconds, the matted wolf was gone. Lying in Marcella's arms was a boy. He was skeletal, his skin translucent and pale, bruised purple in places. He was naked, shivering violently, his collarbone protruding sharply. Around his neck was a ring of raw red flesh where the silver had eaten into him. Constantine let out a sound that was half sob, half roar. He stripped off his linen shirt, leaving himself bare-chested in the freezing room, and wrapped his son in the warm fabric. He scooped the boy up as if he weighed nothing. Frederick's eyes fluttered open. They were no longer milky. They were clear, terrified blue. He looked at Constantine, then his gaze darted frantically to Marcella. "Safe," Marcella whispered, reaching out to brush a lock of hair from his forehead. "You are safe." The boy's head lolled against his father's chest and he passed out. Constantine stood up, clutching his son. He turned to Marcella. He was shirtless, his torso covered in scars of war, his muscles coiled tight. The sheer masculinity of him was overwhelming, but it was the look in his eyes that floored her. It was a look of absolute devastating gratitude. "Come," he said, extending a hand to her. "You are not staying in this room another second. You are coming with me." "To where?" she asked, taking his hand. His skin was burning hot against hers. "To the only place where I can guarantee no one will touch either of you," he growled. "My chambers." The king's chambers were a fortress within a fortress. A massive fireplace roared with life, casting dancing shadows against walls lined with books and ancient weapons. The bed was enormous, draped in furs and silks, and it was there that Frederick now slept, cleaned, bandaged, and sedated by Rowan's potions. Marcella sat in a velvet armchair by the fire, watching the rise and fall of the boy's chest. She had bathed in the adjoining lavatory, scrubbing the filth of the nursery from her skin, and now wore a clean, oversized shirt that Constantine had provided, cinched at the waist with a sash. The door opened, and Constantine entered. He had washed the blood from his hands, but the tension had not left his shoulders. He carried a tray with a steaming bowl of broth and a glass of dark wine. He set the tray on the small table beside her. "Eat," he commanded gently. "You have not eaten since dawn." "I'm not hungry," Marcella said, though her stomach rumbled at the smell of the savory broth. "Eat," he repeated, sinking into the chair opposite her. He looked exhausted. The firelight played across the sharp planes of his face, softening the harshness of his features. "If you collapse, who will watch over him when I must deal with the council?" Marcella picked up the spoon. Is he going to be all right?" "Physically, he will heal. Shifters are resilient," Constantine said, his voice low. He stared into the fire, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. "But the mind? I do not know." He looked up at her, his golden eyes filled with a haunting mixture of shame and awe. "How did you know? How did you see what I could not?" "I listened," Marcella said simply. "Everyone else in this castle was so afraid of the noise, so afraid of your rules, that they stopped listening to the person making the sound. They heard a monster. I heard a child." Constantine flinched as if she had struck him. "I failed him. I let that woman convince me his wolf was diseased. I let her isolate him. I thought I was protecting the pack from a plague." He let out a bitter, dry laugh. "I am the Alpha of the North, the strongest wolf in 3 territories, and I was blind." "You were grieving," Marcella said softly. "Grief makes us blind. And Cressida, she is very good at showing people exactly what she wants them to see." Constantine's gaze hardened. "Cressida has barricaded herself in the East Wing. She has sent ravens to the High Council, claiming I have gone mad and attacked her. She has powerful allies. Politics protect her for the moment, but the moment Frederick speaks, her protection ends." He leaned forward, reaching out. His large hand covered hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through Marcella's arm, warm and sudden. "You saved his life, Marcella," he said, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. The roughness of his calluses against her skin felt incredibly intimate. "You saved my son. There is no debt I can repay that will be enough." "I didn't do it for a debt," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air between them grew thick, charged with the undeniable pull of the mate bond. It was faint, suppressed by trauma and chaos, but it was there, a tether connecting their souls. Constantine seemed to sense it too. His nostrils flared, inhaling her scent, soap, rain, and something sweet underneath. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. "Why?" he asked. "Why did you stay when I came in roaring like a beast? Why didn't you run?" "Because he was scared," she said, looking over at the sleeping boy, "and someone had to be brave for him." Constantine squeezed her hand, his expression fierce. "Then you are the bravest wolf in this keep, Marcella Rosefall. And you are human." A soft whimper from the bed broke the moment. Constantine was there in a flash. Frederick was thrashing in his sleep, caught in a nightmare. No silver, please," the boy mumbled. Constantine sat on the edge of the bed, stroking the boy's hair. "Shh, Fred. It's gone. It's gone." Marcella joined him on the other side. She placed a cool hand on the boy's feverish forehead. Frederick leaned into her touch instantly, his breathing settling. Constantine watched the interaction, a look of profound wonder on his face. He looked at Marcella over his son's sleeping form, and in that look, the dynamic shifted. He was no longer just a king, and she was no longer a maid. They were parents, one biological, one of the heart, united in defense of this child. "Stay," Constantine whispered. "Stay here tonight. I do not trust him with anyone else. I do not trust myself to be enough for him right now." "I will stay," she promised, and as the snow piled up against the window pane, sealing them into their own private world, Marcella fell asleep in the chair, watched over by the Alpha King who would burn the world down before he let anything harm her again. The morning sun brought no warmth to Whitbarrow Keep, only a harsh, blinding light that reflected off the snow. The castle was in a state of suffocating tension. The servants moved like ghosts, terrified to speak. The guards were doubled at every door. Marcella woke with a stiff neck, curled in the armchair. The bed was empty. Panic flared in her chest for a second, until she saw Frederick sitting up against the pillows, holding a mug of warm milk. He looked pale, but the haunted feral look was gone. Constantine was sitting in a chair by the window, reading a scroll, a sword resting casually against his knee. "Good morning," Constantine said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Marcella's chest. "He's awake," Marcella smiled, moving to the bedside. "How do you feel, Frederick?" The boy looked at her. "My neck hurts," he rasped, "but the noise is gone, the buzzing in my head." "That is good," she said gently. "My father told me what you did," Frederick said, his eyes serious beyond his years. "He said you fought him for me." Marcella laughed softly. "I wouldn't say I fought him, I just shouted very loudly." Constantine smirked, a rare expression that transformed his face from terrifying to devastatingly handsome. She shouted very loudly indeed. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. It was Diana Brightmore. "My king," she said, bowing low, though her eyes darted to Marcella with a look of warning. "The High Council emissaries have arrived early. They are in the Solar, and Lady Cressida is with them." Constantine's face darkened. The warmth vanished. "Stay here," he ordered Marcella. "Lock the door behind me. Open it for no one but me or Diana." He stormed out, the heavy door thudding shut. The hours ticked by. Marcella entertained Frederick with stories, keeping him calm. Around noon, Diana returned with a tray of food. "Is it bad?" Marcella asked as Diana set the tray down. "It is a snake pit," Diana hissed. "Cressida is weaving a tale. She claims Frederick is cursed, that the silver was a containment field sanctioned by a dark mage for his own safety. She claims you are a spy sent by rival packs to weaponize the boy against his father." "That's insane," Marcella gasped. "It is politics," Diana replied grimly. "Cressida is the daughter of the Southern Alpha. Accusing her of torture without a confession is complicated, and she is demanding to see the boy to assess his condition." "She will never touch him again," Marcella said fiercely. "The king is holding them back," Diana said, "but he cannot hold the council forever if they vote for an inquiry. Be careful, girl. Cressida knows you are the witness. If you disappear, her story becomes the truth." Diana left, and the atmosphere in the room grew heavy. Frederick had fallen back asleep. Marcella paced the room, feeling trapped. The fire had burned down low. She moved to add a log, but stopped when she saw a piece of parchment slipped under the door. There was no name on it, just a scrawl in elegant, sharp handwriting. "I know about your father's debts, Marcella. I know where your sister lives in the village. Meet me in the Winter Garden in 10 minutes or the debts will be sold to the Slavers' Guild." Marcella's blood ran cold. She didn't have a sister. That was a bluff. But the mention of her father's debts was real. It was the leverage she had feared. But more importantly, if Cressida was threatening her, it meant Cressida was desperate. Marcella looked at the sleeping boy. He was safe here, behind the locked door. She couldn't let Constantine fight this battle blindly. She needed to know what Cressida was planning. It was a trap. She knew it was a trap. But she also knew that a maid in the king's chambers was a liability. If she went, she might be able to get a confession. She grabbed a small silver letter opener from the king's desk and slipped it into her boot. She checked the lock on the door to ensure it locked from the outside, then slipped out into the corridor. The castle was eerily quiet. She navigated the back passages to the Winter Garden, an enclosed courtyard filled with frost-bitten roses and statues of weeping angels. Cressida was waiting by the fountain. She wore a coat of white fox fur, looking like a snow queen. She didn't look afraid of the council. She looked triumphant. You are stupider than I thought, Cressida said, turning around. Her beauty was sharp, like cut glass. I expected you to hide under the Alpha's bed. What do you want? Marcella asked, her hand hovering near her boot. I want you to recant, Cressida said, stepping closer. The smell of lavender was suffocating. You will go to the council. You will tell them you planted the collar. You will tell them you are a witch who enchanted the boy to turn him against me. Why would I do that? Marcella spat. Because, Cressida smiled and pulled a small vial from her pocket. If you don't, I will pour this into the ventilation shaft of the king's chambers. It is odorless, colorless, and it kills wolves instantly. Frederick is weak. He will die first. Constantine will follow. Marcella froze. The threat was tangible. You admit it then, Marcella said, her voice trembling. You wanted them dead. I wanted the crown, Cressida hissed, her mask slipping. Constantine is obsessed with that brat, a weakling, a runt. I need a strong heir. Frederick had to go, and Constantine, he is too sentimental. Once we were married, he would have had a tragic accident, and I would be queen regent. You're a monster, Marcella whispered. I am a queen, Cressida corrected. Now, kneel, pledge your loyalty, or I drop this vial right now. Marcella stared at the vial. She calculated the distance. She could lunge, but if the vial broke... Suddenly, a shadow fell over the garden. A deep, menacing growl vibrated through the stone floor, shaking the snow from the rose bushes. Cressida's eyes went wide. She spun around. Standing on the balcony overlooking the garden, flanked by 3 stone-faced members of the High Council, was Constantine. Did you get all that? Constantine asked, his voice calm, cold, and utterly terrifying. The council elder, an ancient wolf with white hair, looked down at Cressida with disgust. We heard enough, Lady Winterhall. Treason, regicide, and attempted infanticide, Cressida screamed, throwing the vial at Marcella. Marcella didn't think. She threw herself backward, shielding her face. The vial shattered on the stone. A cloud of purple gas erupted. Run! Constantine roared, leaping from the balcony. But the gas was fast. It swirled around Marcella, choking her. She coughed, her lungs burning like fire. As she fell to her knees, the last thing she saw was Constantine crashing into the snow, reaching for her, his eyes wide with a fear she had never seen before. Then, darkness took her. The world was a kaleidoscope of spinning gray sky and the metallic taste of blood. Marcella couldn't feel her legs. The purple gas had burned its way into her throat like swallowed acid, but as darkness clawed at her vision, the only sensation that anchored her to the living world was the crushing grip of arms around her. She was moving, fast. The wind whipped past her face, biting and cold, but the chest she was pressed against was a furnace. Rowan! Now! The roar was so loud it vibrated through her skull. It was Constantine. He sounded terrified. Marcella was laid onto a surface, soft, smelling of lavender and antiseptic. The infirmary. She tried to speak, to tell him she was just dizzy, but her throat seized. A coughing fit racked her body, each spasm sending spikes of agony through her chest. Hold her down, a voice commanded, Rowan. The toxin is wolfsbane concentrate. It targets the shifting enzymes. She is human, Constantine snarled. Why is she reacting like this? Because it's corrosive, you fool, Rowan snapped back, the fear making him bold. It's burning her laryngeal lining. I need to flush it before it scars her lungs permanently. A cool, viscous liquid was forced past her lips. It tasted of mint and raw magic. Marcella gagged, but a large hand smoothed back her hair, gentle despite the trembling she could feel in his fingertips. Breathe, Marcella. Look at me. She forced her eyes open. Constantine was hovering over her, his face a mask of pale devastation. The golden fire in his eyes was dim, replaced by a frantic human panic. He was stripped to his undershirt, his chest heaving as if he had run miles. I'm here, she managed to wheeze, though the voice sounded like grinding stones. Don't speak, he ordered, his thumb brushing a tear from her cheek. Just breathe. That is a command from your king. Hours bled into one another. The burning in her chest slowly subsided to a dull ache. She drifted in and out of consciousness. Every time she woke, he was there. Sometimes he was pacing the length of the infirmary like a caged tiger. Sometimes he was sitting by the bed, holding her hand so tightly she thought her bones might fuse. Once, she woke to the sound of hushed voices. The council has taken Cressida, Rowan was saying quietly. They found the rest of the vials in her chambers. She has been stripped of her title. They are taking her to the ice prison. I don't care about the witch. Constantine's voice was low, laced with exhaustion. I care about the woman in this bed. She will survive, Alpha. The human constitution, it is surprisingly resilient. If she were a wolf, that dose would have stopped her heart. It nearly stopped mine, Constantine murmured. Marcella turned her head on the pillow. The movement caught his eye instantly. He was at her side in a heartbeat, sinking to his knees so his face was level with hers. You're awake, he breathed. You saved me, she whispered. Her throat felt raw, but the pain was manageable. You saved yourself, he corrected intensely. You threw yourself into the poison to protect the evidence, to protect us. Why? Marcella looked at him, really looked at him. The Alpha King, the monster of the North, looked shattered. Because, she whispered, her hand finding his cheek, Frederick needs his father, and you deserve to be happy. Constantine closed his eyes, leaning his face into her palm. He let out a shuddering breath, surrendering to the touch. I have not known happiness since the day my wife died, until a maid with no fear walked into my darkness. He kissed the center of her palm, a gesture of reverence. Rest now, he murmured. When you're strong enough to stand, this kingdom is going to look very different. 3 days later, the great hall of Whitbarrow Keep was packed. The heavy oak doors were thrown wide, allowing the winter sunlight to spill across the stone floor, illuminating the dust motes like floating gold. The atmosphere was not one of fear, as it had been when Marcella first arrived, but of anticipation. Marcella stood at the side of the dais. She wore a dress of deep velvet, the color of midnight, tailored to fit her perfectly. It was a gift from Diana, who had been reinstated as head of staff with a significant pay raise. Constantine sat on the antler throne. He wore his formal regalia, a black tunic embroidered with silver thread, a heavy fur cloak, and the iron circlet of the Alpha King. But he did not look rigid. He looked at ease. At his feet sat Frederick. The boy was still thin, his hair still short where Marcella had cut the mats away, but he was clean. He wore a miniature version of his father's tunic. He looked at the crowd not with terror, but with a shy curiosity. The High Council stood before the throne. The crimes of House Winterhall have been addressed, the elder announced, his voice echoing through the hall. But there remains the matter of the succession, and the matter of the human. A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Constantine stood up. The silence that fell was instant. There is no matter of the human, Constantine said, his voice carrying to the rafters without shouting. There is only the matter of the savior of the House of Whitbarrow. He stepped down from the dais, walking toward where Marcella stood in the shadows. He held out his hand. Marcella hesitated. This was breaking protocol. This was shattering it. Come, he said softly. She took his hand. He led her up the steps, not to the side, but to stand directly beside the throne. The old laws say an alpha must mate with a wolf of high standing to strengthen the bloodline, Constantine addressed the council. Those laws gave me a political match that nearly murdered my son. Those laws brought poison into my home. He looked down at Frederick. Fred, who do you want by your side? Frederick stood up. He looked at the council, then he walked over to Marcella and wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her velvet dress. Marcella, the boy said clearly. Constantine looked at the crowd. My son has spoken, and I... He turned to Marcella, ignoring the hundreds of eyes watching them. He reached up and unclasped the heavy iron cloak from his shoulders. With a solemn, deliberate movement, he placed the Alpha's cloak around Marcella. It was heavy, smelling of him, pine, musk, and snow. It swamped her small frame, but the symbolism was unmistakable. I claim her, Constantine declared, his voice ringing with power. She is under my protection, she is under my roof, and if she will have me, she is in my heart. The council shifted uncomfortably. Alpha, the elder warned, she is human. She cannot bear a shifter heir, the bloodline. My bloodline is standing right there, Constantine pointed to Frederick, alive because of her. If I have to choose between a pure lineage and a love that is true, I choose the truth. He looked at Marcella, his golden eyes searching hers for an answer. Well, Marcella Rosefall, will you accept a broken king and his healing pup? Marcella felt the tears prick her eyes. She looked at the crowd, at the scary stone-faced wolves. Then she looked at the man who had held her while she couldn't breathe. "I'm not afraid of the cold anymore," she whispered, loud enough for him to hear. "Yes." The cheer that erupted from the back of the room, started by Diana and the kitchen staff, was hesitant at first, but it grew. It wasn't the roar of an army, it was the sound of a household waking up from a long, dark nightmare. The celebration had lasted late into the night, but Marcella and Constantine had slipped away. They stood on the highest balcony of the West Wing. The wind was gentle tonight, carrying the promise of a coming spring. Below them, the snow-covered valley glowed under the light of a full moon. Marcella leaned against the stone railing, the Alpha's heavy cloak still wrapped around her shoulders. She felt anchored. For the first time in her life, she wasn't running from debts or hiding in the shadows. Constantine stood behind her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel his heat radiating against her back. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. "I am," she said, turning to face him. "Frederick is asleep." "Out like a light. Diana is guarding his door with a rolling pin. I pity anyone who tries to disturb him." Constantine stepped closer. The moonlight turned his skin to alabaster and his eyes to liquid silver. "You changed everything, Marcella. You walked into a tomb and threw open the windows." "I just cleaned up a mess," she smiled faintly. "You healed my son," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He reached out, his large hands cupping her face. His thumbs traced her cheekbones. "And you woke me up." The air between them crackled. It wasn't just the cold, it was the undeniable pull of the mate bond, a biological imperative that defied species. The wolf inside him recognized her soul. "They will still talk," Marcella whispered, searching his eyes. "The council, the other packs. They will say you weakened yourself by choosing a human." "Let them talk," Constantine growled softly. "Let them come and see. They will see a king who has something worth fighting for. Strength isn't about bloodlines, Marcella. It's about what you are willing to die for, and I would burn the world for you." He lowered his head. His breath ghosted over her lips. "May I?" he asked, a king asking permission of a maid. "Yes," she breathed. His lips met hers. It wasn't tentative, it was acclaiming. It was hungry and desperate and filled with a tenderness that shattered her last defenses. He kissed her like a drowning man finding air. Marcella wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, tangling her fingers in the hair at the nape of his neck. The kiss deepened, full of promises and fire. In his arms, amidst the snow and the stone, she didn't feel like a servant. She felt like a queen. When he finally pulled back, resting his forehead against hers, they were both breathless. "The West Wing needs a new mistress," he murmured against her skin. "I was thinking we could repaint the nursery. Yellow, perhaps, something bright." Marcella laughed, a sound that rang clear and happy into the night. "Yellow sounds perfect." Constantine pulled her into his embrace, wrapping his arms around her in the cloak, shielding her from the wind. They stood there, watching the moon rise over their kingdom. A kingdom no longer ruled by fear, but by a love that had clawed its way out of the dark. 1 year later. The snow had finally retreated from the valley floor, replaced by a carpet of purple heather and wild white roses. Marcella sat on a blanket in the garden, the same garden where she had almost died. The fountain bubbled cheerfully, the water clear and sparkling. "Higher! Push me higher!" Frederick was laughing. He sat on a wooden swing that had been hung from the great oak tree. He was unrecognizable from the skeletal creature Marcella had found. He had filled out, his cheeks rosy with health, his blue eyes bright with mischief. Constantine stood behind the swing, his shirt sleeves rolled up, pushing his son with gentle rhythmic shoves. The king looked younger. The lines of stress around his mouth had softened. He laughed as Frederick squealed with delight. Marcella rested her hand on her stomach, where a small growing bump was just beginning to show. The healers were baffled. A human carrying a shifter's child was rare, but Rowan had declared the baby strong. Constantine caught her eye. He stopped the swing and walked over, leaving Frederick to pump his legs and keep the momentum going. The Alpha King dropped to the grass beside her. He picked up a strawberry from the picnic basket and offered it to her. "Tired?" he asked softly. "Just happy," she smiled, taking the fruit. Constantine leaned over and kissed her temple, then placed his large hand over her belly. "He is kicking." "She," Marcella corrected playfully. "We shall see." Constantine grinned. He looked at Frederick, then back at the castle that loomed behind them. It no longer looked like a jagged tooth, with the windows open and flags snapping in the breeze. It looked like a home. "Thank you," he whispered to her as he did every day. "For what?" "For the spring." Marcella leaned her head on his shoulder. The winter had been long and hard, but the thaw had finally come, and in the warmth of the sun, surrounded by her pack, she knew they would never be cold again. The story of the Alpha King and the Maid is a testament to the power of compassion over cruelty. While ancient laws and prejudices sought to bury the truth in darkness, it was the courage of one human woman that shattered the chains of the past. Constantine and Marcella proved that family is not defined by blood or species, but by the fierce commitment to protect and heal one another. Their love didn't just save a child, it redeemed a kingdom, reminding us that even the coldest winters must eventually yield to the warmth of spring. If you enjoyed this story of healing, justice, and romance, please hit that like button. It helps us so much. Don't forget to share this with a friend who loves a good shifter romance, and subscribe for more stories of destiny and love.